I'm not sure if what I'm going to say is true, but good afternoon. We're gathered in memory of somebody who is very special to us. And for those of us who have come to know him over time, his departure has been a sore spot. And yet, his departure because of the recent years is a blessing, and he is at rest. It's my privilege to welcome each of you to this afternoon service of remembrance for Don Stoyanowski, and to share by your presence and your words of comfort and assurance to Phyllis and her family, your friendship and your delight in having known somebody who is very special to Phyllis and the family. So we thank you for being here, and on behalf of the family, we say thank you for the time you have put aside to be here, and some, like myself, have done a little traveling to get here, and we just want to say for them also, thank you for that. For those who have known Don, there's always one special thing that we remember. My first memory of him is when I accepted the invitation to come to the Vancouver Central Church, as it was called in those days. And at some point, I had the privilege of meeting him. I'd never seen him before, but when he approached me, he had that marvelous, never met a stranger kind of a smile. And every time I saw him after that, there were very few occasions when I could see him serious. He would tell jokes and he would laugh. He would give encouragement, and when it was all done, he'd say, "Now, that's to encourage you." And there was that phenomenal smile again. And so it is with comfort that we say today, Don, rest in peace. The last 6 years have been difficult, and I don't know how somebody like Phyllis and others here who have had loved ones who have disappeared even while they were still alive and married, how they manage it without the Lord's goodness, his grace, and the courage that he gives us. And so while we're here, it is not so much to be sad for Don, because some of us lost him some 6 years ago. The reason for us to be here is to be of comfort and strength to the family, and to thank God for the wonderful promises of his word and the assurance that the grave is not the end. And for Don, his preaching ministry encouraged the thought beyond the grave. And I'm so grateful this afternoon for words of a very, very Adventist hymn, a couple of lines of which we'll share with you because I know Don loved the concept in these words. We have this hope that burns within our hearts, hope in the coming of the Lord. We have this faith which Christ alone imparts, faith in the promise of his word. And as we gather this afternoon, it is the promise of the word that brings us comfort and the assurance of a get-together someday in the future in God's wisdom and his time. And so for a scripture reading that kind of sets the tone for this, and it's something that all of us as preachers often use at the graveside, I'm sharing with you from Eugene Peterson's The Message, from 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18, a rather refreshing way of approaching this. And regarding the question, friends, that has come up about what happens to those already dead and buried, we don't want you in the dark any longer. First off, you must not carry on over like people who have nothing to look forward to, as if the grave were the last word. Jesus died and broke loose from the grave, and God will most certainly bring back to life those who died in Jesus. And then this, we can tell you with complete confidence, we have the Master's word on it, that when the Master comes again to get us, those of us who are still alive will not get a jump on the dead and leave them behind. In actual fact, they'll be ahead of us. The Master himself will give the command. Archangel thunder and God's trumpet blast. Then he'll come down from heaven and the dead in Christ will rise. They'll go first. Then the rest of us who are still alive at the time will be caught up with them into the clouds to meet the Master. Oh, we'll be walking on air. And then there will be one huge family reunion with the Master. So reassure one another with these words. May they also be of comfort to us as we reflect on Don's passing and the great joy someday to meet him in person.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're really glad to see you here to celebrate Dad's life. I don't know if you know, on the side, you see the mountain there. That's called Fisher Peak, and it's the Rockies that are right next to Cranbrook, British Columbia, where we spent many years of our lives, and Dad climbed that mountain in the 70s. So Randy was able to find that and put that on there, so that's special for us. So we're really grateful that you're here to help celebrate Dad's life. And, you know, how do you capture a man's life, especially one that lived life to the fullest, in just a few minutes or a few moments? And the answer is you don't. That's why this life sketch is going to be approximately 3 hours long. So buckle up. And no, I'm kidding. It's going to be 2.5 max. This is my sister, Sandy. I love her dearly. And she's presently single. And if there's any single men out there, talk to me after. My dad taught me to never let an opportunity go to waste. Mm-hmm. So that's in honor of him. So, your turn.
Oh, my turn. Okay, kind of threw me off. Dad was born to Walter and Rosella in Prince Albert on May 30th, 1941. He had an older sister, Sylvia, who predeceased him back in 2007, and 2 younger brothers, Larry and Albert, who are right there, and they both reside here in BC. For the first 5 years of Dad's life, they lived in Honeymoon, Saskatchewan, and then they later moved on to Sandburg, Saskatchewan. And during their early years, Dad's mom spent a year in the sanitarium for TB. On the farm, they worked hard, but they also had fun playing hockey on the slough, and then when the snow melted, they'd get back on it in a raft for slow when it melted. Each morning before heading off to the one-room schoolhouse, Dad's chores were to milk the cows. And Dad loved to live on the farm. When he was just 12 years old, he also got his own team of horses to help out with the harvest. He had fond memories of his horses, Katie and Charlie, and his hound dog, Laddie. When Dad was 17, the family moved to Waco, Texas, where they only stayed for about 3 months. Growing up in the prairies, Dad did not have the opportunity to learn how to swim. And when they were down in Waco, there was a pond that everybody used to go swimming at. And Dad was just tall enough that when he jumped in, he could stand up on his tiptoes, breathe air, and walk his way out of the water. Well, one time they had a big rainstorm that came through, and so all the kids headed off to the pond to go swimming. And Dad jumped in and stood up, took a deep breath, and all he did was swallow in a bunch of water. And one of the other guys jumped into the water, saved his life. He actually became a doctor, but we knew that God had a plan. From Texas, they headed for Summerland, BC. Our grandfather had actually been there and worked in the orchards in his early 60s, in his early 20s, and he actually worked with our grandmother at that time. Because he had fond memories of the Okanagan, they decided that the Okanagan was a perfect place for the family to live. And on the way to Summerland, they stopped at Yellowstone National Park. The family asked Grandpa if they could stay overnight at Yellowstone, and he said no, because if ever there was an earthquake, we would not get out of here. Well, when they crossed the Canada-US border, the border guard asked them, did you guys come through Yellowstone? And they said yes, and he told them that there had been a huge earthquake that night, and many people had died. God had a plan.
Dad graduated from high school in Summerland in the spring of 1960, and he needed a date for grad. So he asked his sister Sylvia, who was taking secretarial classes with our mom Phyllis, if she would be his date for the grad, and Phyllis said yes. And this was the first date of many. Mom first introduced Dad to Grandma in her flower garden. Later that night, Grandma told Mom she had met Dad before. Dad had been hanging out with some buddies at the local bowling alley, and someone stepped on his foot, and when he pulled his foot back, he kicked someone behind him right in the backside. He turned around and apologized, and he said, "I'm so sorry," to which this lady responded, "I should hope so." But there was a grin on her face, and that was later going to be his mother-in-law. After his high school graduation, Dad got his first job working in the fruit cannery. Following the seasonal shutdown of the cannery, he then went to work at a small sawmill. After that, Dad went to work for K&H Logging, which was owned by Ben Carlstrom and Johnny Hanks, who were both married to cousins of our mother. Mom and Dad had some interesting dates over the next several years, and on January 1st, next several months, and on January 1st, 1961, Dad proposed, and on September 3rd, 1961, Dad at the age of 20 and Mom at the age of 18 were married. Their first home was a travel trailer where they lived in Penticton, then Karameas, and then back to Summerland in a matter of months. This was the first of 22 moves over the next 7 years. In total, Dad and Mom moved over 50 times. You would think he was running from the law, but he was actually just moving to wherever the work was. After only 4 months of being married, Dad came home from logging in the bush with 28 carbuncles, more commonly known as cluster of boils from his waist down. Mom was able to get 18 of them to dry up using iodine, but the others grew bigger and bigger, and Dad had to go to the hospital to have them lanced. The doctor was an old army doctor and never gave him anything for pain, and the only thing Dad could do was hang onto the railing as the doctor lanced them. Dad was in so much pain that the three attending nurses had to leave the room individually upon seeing how much agony he was in. When Dad got back to work, his boss sent him out by himself to fall trees in minus 30 Fahrenheit weather so that he could make some extra money back after being off work. Due to the weather circumstances, he should not have been working alone even back in those days. One of the trees Dad cut down slid back off a stump before it was frozen, and when he tried to get out of the way, he tripped over a log hidden in the snow. The tree fell on Dad's leg, trapping him between the two logs. He tried to start his chainsaw, but was unable to. All he could do was lay there believing he was going to freeze to death. Meanwhile, his future cousin-in-law, who's here today, Steve Crombie, came down the trail on a cat. Dad heard the cat coming and he started to yell and wave his hands. And it was a miracle that Steve was able to notice him. Dad's boots had frozen to his feet and they had to cut them off, and he ended up in a full leg cast. It was so heavy that Mom had to help him move it just so that he could get around walking in the trailer. Due to laying out in the freezing weather, Dad's kidneys were damaged and it affected him the rest of his life. But God had a plan. For a while, Dad was not able to go back to the bush to work due to his injuries from that accident, so he had to take the worst job ever in his life, and that was trying to sell Electrolux vacuum cleaners. But he did have success. 2 successes. He sold a second-hand one to his mother and a new one to a friend for whom the company never paid him out on it because it was on installments and he quit long before the payments were paid out.
So, in 1962, Dad went back to work for Jacobson Brothers at Beaver Valley, just outside of Horsefly, which is just outside of Williams Lake, working in their sawmill, leaving Mom in Summerland, expecting their first child. The proudest day of Dad's life, I am sure of, was the day that I was born, which was January 8, 1963. The best always comes first, which would be me, of course. He missed my birth, even though he drove Mom over every single bumpy road he could find in Summerland, even talking her into drinking castor oil to try to get me to come. But I was stubborn like my parents, and I waited another 7 days before I came. About 6 weeks later, Dad moved his small family to Beaver Valley. Now, I know some of you have heard this story, and I'm going to share it again, and this time, or I'm not sharing it again, I'm going to share it for the first time. Dad told it all the time. I even went out to Halifax, and I got the question, were you the girl? So, Mom needed to get out of the trailer for a break, so she had changed me, got me ready, and then left. No sooner had Dad left, and I gave him a big present in my diapers. So Dad's first response, this is where his, what do I call them? Problem-solving skills kicks in. He yells out the door for Mom. Somebody else hears him yelling, so they said, I'll try and find her. Well then, when that didn't work, and I just learned this, he laid a bunch of newspapers out on the floor, laid me on the floor, then proceeded to stick me in the toilet and flush. Now, it was just above freezing, so you can imagine how cold that water was. And I am told that I would not look at him for 2 weeks. And if he came close to me, I would start to cry. So I was definitely not Daddy's little girl at that time. It's you.
That's my favorite story ever. So at the request of Dad's granddaughter, Carly, she wanted us to tell you a little bit about Dad and the pies. The fall after the devastating toilet incident, Dad and Mom moved back to Summerland, and he went to work out of town in a small sawmill. Dad had to provide his own food for the week, so each Friday, Mom would bake 7 large pies, 2 for the weekend and 5 to take to camp. Carly thought that the guys at camp must have really appreciated Mom for baking those pies, but sadly for his co-workers, they were only consumed by Dad, as he would eat a pie a day. Dad ended up working at another large sawmill, but with food included this time. Dad was working on the head saw, which cuts the logs into different sizes, and one day he forgot to put on his leather apron. Dad leaned forward, and one of the gears grabbed his pants and started to pull him into the saw. He grabbed a bar and hung on as the gear twisted his clothes until they literally ripped off of his body. If that wasn't enough, a few weeks later, he was cleaning out the area where they cut the logs. One of the workers, without checking the vicinity, turned on the machine, and once again, Dad had to grab a bar over his head, and the machine that gripped the logs took a hold of his boots and were chewing at them. He started to yell and struggle for release until a worker heard him and turned off the machine, narrowly escaping catastrophe. This is just another of a couple of instances where Dad's guardian angel was working hard, and God had a plan.
Dad quit working at the sawmill and logging and moved on to construction. Little did he know that he would have an aptitude for construction and that it would be his passion. In 1964, Dad went to work once again for Johnny Hanks, but this time in construction. Dad sold the travel trailer to his brother Larry, and the family moved into a tent on the beach in Trout Creek, just outside of Summerland. One night, it was dark out, and the family had a visitor. It just happened to be black with a white stripe down his back. Mom woke Dad to let him know there was skunk in the tent, and he whispered to Mom to pull me into bed with them. And they talked softly until finally the skunk decided it was time to leave. The family shortly after that moved to Penticton. The following summer, Mom's uncle passed away, and Dad took on the responsibility of 5 orchards, as well as his regular job. He would get up early in the morning and go change all the sprinklers in the 5 orchards, and since there was only one picker, he put his problem-solving skills to good this time, and thus U-Pick was developed in the Okanagan. That same year, Dad moved his family to Coston, just outside of Karameas, and bought his first horse, Scout. That fall, he was riding him out to winter pasture along Highway 3, which was not a busy road at that time of year. However, a tourist was driving along, and when he looked up, he was right in front of Dad and Scout, and instead of swerving over to the other side of the road, he laid on his horn, and Scout tried to jump over the car, went over one side of the windshield and down on the other side of the car. All of Scout's legs were broken, and he had to be put down. And when the police arrived, they would not shoot Scout for Dad. And they took him back to his house, even though Dad was in terrible condition, so that Dad could get his gun. Mom then had to drive Dad 30 miles to the hospital in Penticton, where he laid in bed for 2 days with the staff thinking that he actually had broken his neck. So this was on a Sunday. He never got x-rays until the following Tuesday, but he hadn't broken his neck, and we thank him for that. God had a plan.
So in 1966, Dad once again went back to K&H logging, while Mom and Sandy stayed with the grandparents, as she was expecting her second child. Once again, Dad was not around for my birth in 1967, but was overjoyed that he got a son, which would be me. In 1967, he got a job working for Taylor and Olson Construction as an apprentice. Dad completed his apprenticeship in 2 years instead of 4 and was the first person to get 100% on his exams. He soon became the foreman on the job site in Penticton, where he and Mom said goodbye to trailers and tenting and built their first home together. Around this time, Dad had also competed in an international carpenters competition in Victoria, and he came in second. Then in 1972, Dad moved the family once again to the East Kootenays and finally to Cranbrook after we spent a summer in Fernie. So during that summer, we didn't really know the Fernie area. And one day it was super, super hot. And we needed to cool off, so we were wanting to find a swimming place. And we drove back into Fernie over the little bridge, over the river, and we looked down, and the bank slowly went down to this beautiful beach on this kind of a corner there of the river. And we got into our bathing suits, and we dived into the water, and we were having the time of our lives. And we were swimming and frolicking away, and we were enjoying ourselves. And all of a sudden, this gentleman stopped, and he came down, and he said, "Are you guys enjoying yourselves?" And we said, "Absolutely." And he said, You're not from around here, are you?" And we said, No. And he said, do you see up there, that pipe there? That's where all the sewer from Fernie dumps into the river. So you never saw people exit water faster in your life. And we scurried out so fast, and we went home and had several showers that evening.
So then, in 1973, 2 architects from Cranbrook that Dad had worked with previously on different sites suggested he start his own company and bid on 7 jobs that they had just assigned, including seniors' homes, schools, hotels, etc. Dad told them that he had no experience bidding on jobs, and when they told him that they would show him how to bid, they also informed him that he might be lucky if he got one of the jobs. Dad ended up winning all 7 jobs. He had no carpenters or laborers for the job sites, so he had to hire them basically off of the streets in each community he had a building going on. The 7 job sites included Cranbrook, Golden, Nicholson, Roslyn, Elkford, and Sparwood. For the first 3 years of his business, he worked 21 hours per day. As he was driving from site to site, hitting all 7 sites in one day, where he was traveling approximately 900 miles, back in the days we had miles, per day. Dad would call Mom and tell her what he needed, building materials, tools, etc., for the next site. So when he arrived in town, the pickup was ready and loaded for him to keep going. Needless to say, he got a lot of speeding tickets, and at one time had a total of 24 points. Dad received a letter from the government telling him that they were going to pull his license. So he wrote a letter back to the government, informing them that if they pulled his license, he would be putting 50 people out of work. And not only that, he actually said, you know something? It used to be the crooks that lived or hid in the ditches. Now it's the cops. So they wrote back to him and told him that he had to attend a driver's ed course, and they also knocked his points down to 3 points, and from then on, the police would wave at him as he drove by them. So during his years in construction, some of the big projects were the Kimberley Ski Hill development, 3 Mormon churches, schools, banks, hotels, and the Radium Golf Course resort. But there are way too many for us to remember.
So Dad had a dream of owning a ranch in the Rockies one day. So he asked Mom to go and find him one, see what she could come up with. And she did. An old rundown ranch with a creek running through it. Mom was sure he would not want it, but he fell in love with it at first sight. When his dad and his brother Larry saw it, they thought that he was crazy, but he had a dream. So in the spring of 1979, Dad became the proud owner of a fixer-upper ranch. The ranch had 400 acres with a 1-room cabin, numerous buildings, and a 2-bedroom house that had to be pulled down as the rats had taken over. Dad, Mom, and I moved into the 1-room cabin from a rather large house that we had in Cranbrook. Sandy was at CUC, and so this is what you call downsizing. Oh, did I mention that it had an outhouse and no running water, no power, or phone service? Nowadays, you would call that living off the grid, and our family, I guess, was just ahead of the times. So at first, water needed to be hauled from the spring, but Dad wanted running water. So we found a spring up in the hills 1.5 miles up the mountainside, and soon Dad, Grandpa, and myself, with the help of a backhoe, dug a 6-foot deep trench and put in pipes to bring water to the ranch. Now, everything went pretty good, except there was a few rock obstructions that you couldn't dig through. So what do? The solution, dynamite. So we had these big this big gas drill with 4 handles, and I remember we got drilled down 3, 4, 5 feet. Then we'd pack it with dynamite. We'd put in the 6-foot cap line, and then we'd tie the 1 to 2 foot leader line onto it. And basically, both of them burn at a foot a minute. So then when we would set it, we'd scurry down the hill for 6 to 7 minutes. Then we'd watch our watch, because you didn't want to go too far, because then if something happened, you'd have to go back up there. So Dad and I lit the fuse, and we walked fairly quickly, several hundred meters down the hill. And about 6 or 7 minutes, we stopped and we're waiting. And it's like an eternity. You're just waiting and waiting. Then all of a sudden, kaboom! We could hear the rocks flying and crashing into tree branches. This symphony of noise and destruction then all of a sudden became silent when everything settled back down to the earth. Except for this one noise. And it was like, and I don't know if any of you ever watched the Roadrunner and the Coyote cartoons. It was really similar to that. this whistle was going on. And we couldn't figure out what it was. It didn't make sense because everything had landed back down. And we kept hearing this just, and we were looking up in the air, and we were wondering what was going on, and it was getting closer. And Dad was behind me, and I looked back, and all of a sudden, thunk, something hit me in the forehead of my hard helmet and knocked my hard helmet off. And so Dad bends over and starts laughing. It was a coiled up piece of dynamite paper that had been blown off of the dynamite, and the force had forced it like a missile to come, and it directly came and hit me right in the forehead. So what are the chances of that? What are the odds of that? Dad and me, we laughed and laughed, and that was such a good memory. And basically, that's how we rolled in the 70s. So, now, like many of us, Dad is not perfect, and he could be quite intense at times. Some of you might have noticed that. He could be impatient and stubborn also. And thankfully, I got the impatient gene from him, which my wife is thankful for every day of our marriage. And this one beside me got the stubborn gene, which the rest of the world is thankful for every day. Now, many of you might not know this. Dad had an issue for a time with gambling. He sometimes would make bets that he would lose. And I, being a good son, was able to exploit and take advantage of these shortcomings. And this is how I did it. So we were building a cabin one day, and we had to put in these interior walls. And so he needed me to go get a chalk line so we could lay out the walls. And he said, go to the oil shed. It's in there. It's in the toolbox. And if any of you ever knew my dad, everything had to be done yesterday. So you jump on your motorcycle, you jump in your car or your truck, and you zoom over there. And if you're not throwing up gravel or dirt, you're not doing it fast enough. And you're going to meet his wrath. So I whipped over there, and I looked everywhere for this chalk line. And it wasn't there. And I looked in the toolbox twice. I looked around the rest of it, and I knew I had to go back. And I knew he was not going to be happy. So I went back, and I said to him, it's not there. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. And I hated to conflict with my dad. So I had developed this way of kind of dealing with it. And I said to him, I bet you a brand new motorcycle it's not there. And then I bet something else. And I truthfully can't remember what I bet him. And it was significant. He said, fine. So we marched over to the shed. And we looked and looked and looked. And he looked everywhere. He emptied the toolbox out. It was not there. And he was grumbling and moaning. And he said, fine, fine. And we walked away. Now, he later came back and said, you know what, I did move it, I forgot about it. But the next week, I had a brand new XR 350R sitting in the driveway, and it was my favorite bike ever. But there is a sad part to this, and that is that's the last time he ever bet me.
So you cured him of his gambling habit?
Yes, I cured him of his gambling habit. So soon on the ranch, it began to grow. We had a herd of cattle. We had 18 horses. We had chickens, turkeys, geese, and even a pet deer, Bambi, because we were very original with names. And there was many dogs and cats throughout the year. So I think it was our second year on the ranch. Dad had this desire to relive his childhood and get back to farming in a way that he had many years before. And so we took a trip to Saskatchewan, and we bought several pieces of old dilapidated farming equipment. And there was this thing called a Stuker, as far as I remember, and it had this swath that was not much wider than this. And it would cut the whatever it was, the grass, the hay, and then it would force it back into a sheave, wrap a twine around it, and then put it into the carrying case behind. And probably 6, 7, 8 would go in there, and then we'd pull the lever, and it would dump onto the ground, and then he'd pull it back up, and then we'd fill it back up again. And this year, we had decided to grow oats. And we had a bumper crop, and these oats grew 7 to 8 feet tall. Dad could walk in there, and we couldn't see him. And he was very tall. Now, then what we would do is we have to then go and set up these sheaves like a teepee and let them dry out. And then we'd have to go back and turn them every couple of days for 2 more times to make sure they were dry before they would load them on the wagon and then put them up by the barn. So we started doing this, and this was the hardest work we ever did. And Dad was having the time of his life. He was singing, he was whistling, and then his singing started to slow down, and then his whistling started to slow down, and pretty soon there was no whistling, there was no singing. It was so hot, and it was so hard work. And you know that song, Bringing in the Sheaves? Bringing in the sheaves, we will come rejoicing. There was no rejoicing. It was awful. And it was such hard work. And the next summer, a semi shows up with a brand new versatile tractor, which had a cab and air conditioning and even a radio, and a brand new baler. And that was the last time he ever tried to relive his childhood on the ranch.
Now, this is not the new tractor. This was our very first tractor that we had out there, so it was a small one. I think this was the one he used with the binder, right?
That's a Massey Ferguson.
Yeah. So Dad also had a dream of having a lake. So what did he do? He built one, or should I say we built one. He had big machines brought in and built a lake that was approximately 4 acres with a couple of islands, a swinging bridge, and a rope that you could fly through the air across the water and dunk yourself in. The ranch was a place where everyone loved to hang out at, and often the floors of the cabin at night were covered with sleeping bags. Lawrence would have his friends from town, and I would bring my friends back from CUC. And just to get to the washroom at night, this is an 8-foot cabin, right? So we had a 1 bedroom and a front room. You'd have to walk over all these bodies in sleeping bags just to get to the bathroom. Then in the summer of 1979, Mom and Dad held the first of many Kootenai camp meetings on the ranch. As well, this was the first mini camp meeting in BC. This is about the time that we had a new member join our family. And she was a chosen sister, Marina. She had already been coming to the ranch for about 2 years and became a part of our family sort of officially when she was 12. A year later, her younger sister, Dorothy, joined us, who was 7 at the time. Also came to live with us. Marina was a total tomboy, and she loved the ranch more than anything, and of course the horses. She is still horse crazy today.
Now, there are so many interesting stories, and interesting things happen to Dad all the time. So one of these stories was we took a short day trip. I did with Mom and Dad on one Sunday. We took, I think it was down to Sandpoint, Idaho, and we were attending a horse auction there. And Dad purposefully left his credit cards at home because he didn't want to be tempted into buying anything else. But when he saw a team of Appaloosa horses pulling a buggy, he mentioned to Mom that he wished he had brought his credit cards with him because he would have loved to buy this team of horses. And that was back in the day before online banking and e-transfers. Well, they happened to be sitting next to a gentleman that overheard them talking. And this gentleman overheard the conversation and offered Dad the money to buy the horses and the buggy. And Dad didn't know this guy from Adam. And Dad said thanks, but no thanks, as he did not even know this person. But insisting, however, the gentleman said that he was also from Cranbrook, and he knew of Dad and his good reputation, and we'd gladly loan him the money. And he even hauled the horses and the buggy he bought to the ranch for Dad, and that's how Dad became the proud owner of a team of Appaloosa horses. So kind of crazy stuff like that would happen. Now, there were times where I would be the only one on the ranch. Mom and Dad would head into town, and I would have the ranch to myself. I would do the chores. I would feed the animals. And then every once in a while, you'd get bored, 11, 12, 13 years old. And sometimes you just had the need for speed. And I needed to just have some fun in the vehicle, so I whipped down the back road to the north field, and having quite a bit of wisdom at the age of 12, I knew how I could pull this off and have some fun and not get caught and pull the wool over my parents' eyes. So what I did is I went to the back field, I opened the gate, and Dad had gone in there once to do something, and there were some tracks on there. So I made sure and lined the tracks from the truck up with that so he wouldn't be able to see that I had gone in there. Then I followed it into the middle of the field, and the grass was 3-4 feet high. So I proceeded to cut donuts for about a half an hour. Just dirt was flying everywhere, mud was flying everywhere, grass was flying everywhere. And then I stopped and then gently drove back down the trail out of the gate and closed it. And I looked back, can't see anything. So I accomplished what I set out to do. And then later on that evening, Dad said, "Hey, sonny boy." And whenever he said sonny boy, I was in trouble. And I heard sonny boy often during my years growing up.
A lot.
And he said, "You know what, the weirdest thing?" And I said, "What?" He says, "Aliens came to our backfield and they made crop circles in our backfield like they do in England." And I said, What, really?" He goes, "Yeah, there's these crop, and it's amazing. I thought only these crop circles happened in England, but they happened to us here." And I was like, "Oh my goodness." And he's like, "Weird. Hey, sonny boy." Well, in my wisdom, I had forgotten that the road to get to our driveway was halfway up Plum Bob Mountain, and you could look into the valley and see all of our fields and see all of our houses, and he could see these circles in the field like nobody's business. And you saw that tractor there a little bit ago, that Massey Ferguson. It had a really low first gear. And so what I would do is I would rev the throttle up as high as I could, put it in bull low, and then I would crank the clutch off and on, trying to make the front of the tractor rise up. And I would get it 2-3 feet off the air, and Dad was always saying, "Why is this tractor always pulling to the left? It just, I don't understand it. Do you know?" And I just, "No, that's a good question." But we both knew.
Another one of Dad's ideas was to build a small ski hill or toboggan run. Here is another time where he put his brainstorming abilities into high gear. Dad and Grandpa took the cat and started to clear off the hill when they ran into a rather large rock and decided to use dynamite once again. Now, in this case, they didn't want to take the whole rock out. They just wanted to level it flat. So they added dynamite to the top of it, just laid it over the whole top of the rock. They added a long fuse to it. Then they took a load of dirt and dumped it on top of it to hold everything in place. They lit the fuse, jumped in the pickup, and headed to the far end of the hayfield, while not telling anybody what they were doing. And anybody means my mother. So they head to the end of the field, and they wait for the big bang to happen. And then the big bang happens. And so my grandpa wants to get out of the truck. And my dad's like, no, gotta wait, because whatever goes up has to come down. And pretty soon it was raining rocks all over the hayfield that we had previously picked rocks from. So after that they head up to the house, and Mom's like, "What happened?" And they're like, "Why?" The house had literally lifted off of the foundation, and luckily for Dad, it settled right back down in place again. So just a few days after that, Dad headed into town and ran into somebody that said, "Hey, did you feel that earthquake that happened out by your place?" And then Dad's like, "Earthquake? What earthquake? What day did that happen?" And it just happened to coincide with the same day that Dad had blown up the rock. Shortly after this, Dad and Mom started to attend the new SDA church that was started in Fernie, BC, as they wanted to help support the new minister there. They started doing Bible studies with a family in Coleman, Alberta, and this was an 80-mile drive just one way to give these Bible studies. These Bible studies led to 5 baptisms of the Bertiotti family. Dad and Mom have been great friends with Pat and Larry ever since. And these were Dad's first baptisms. Then, when Dad decided to start a junior camp on the ranch, they needed to find a camp nurse. One day in his office, there was a conversation happening with Bobby and Fred Walker, who were painters for him on different of his job sites. And it was discovered at that time that Bobby actually was a paramedic and worked for the ambulance service, and she was also an instructor, so she had piles of training. She actually volunteered to come out to the camp and be the camp nurse as long as Dad would give them Bible studies. So these were the next people that Dad introduced to Jesus, and they were baptized. That's you.
So Dad and Mom were also very charitable with their time and money, and Dad participated in various Maranatha projects, and specifically a missionary trip one year to Fiji in 1979. And I had the fortune of going with them, and we were building we were building student housing for married students. And while we were there, up to that date, we had the biggest cyclone that had ever hit Fiji. It was on March 25th, and it was called Cyclone Melly. There was a cyclone afterwards that was a bit bigger, and it was actually a pretty incredible experience. It rained 12 inches in 6 hours, which is incredible. And we had so many good times and so many different experiences that Mom and Dad took us on. So then in 1984, Dad and Mom decided to follow their children to Canadian Union College, known as CUC in Parkview Adventist Academy. CUC, as we all know, is now Burman University. So Dad closed down his construction company and moved to Lacombe, Alberta, taking along with them their two foster daughters, Marina and Dorothy, as well. Now, before he did this, he came to, I don't know, I was 17, 18, I can't remember how old I was. And he said to me, you know, he had a very, very profitable business. He did very well. And it was one of the biggest, if not biggest, construction companies in the East Kootenays. And he said, if you want to take over the company, I will keep it running for a few more years while you get trained and educated and become a carpenter. And I'll let you take it over. And he said, do you want to do that? And I saw the toll that it had taken on him. And it was really hard on our family, and it was really hard on him. And I said no, I didn't want to take it over. And I regret that decision every day of my life now. No, I don't. But it was the right thing to do, and I'm glad we moved.
So from there, like he said, we all headed out to CUC, and I had the fortunate or unfortunate experience of actually being in Old Testament class with Dad. And the first day that we were in class, the instructor asked, so, are you guys married? I was completely horrified. I mean, horrified. So we had to laugh because when Dad was in construction, he had little tape recorders, and for every job, he would have a tape recorder. So when he had those 7 jobs, he had 7 tape recorders, and he would just record in each one of those everything he needed to know. So he had gotten out of note-taking, etc. So when he went to class, he had yellow highlighter pens, and I mean multiple yellow highlighter pens. And so he would mark everything that he thought was important in his textbook that he would need for exams, etc. So the guys at the table that were with him, they said, why don't you just get a paintbrush? Because he literally had everything covered in his books. So after about a year at CUC, Dad had several different calls for work. He'd been asked to go to It Is Written as a Bible worker. He'd been asked to go pastoring. He'd been asked to become the manager of the furniture factory. And he'd also, during this time, had become the employment, employment guy for all the students. And so he had kept really busy. And also Dad, when he actually went back to school or CUC with us, he was 43 at the time. Then, into his second year at CUC, the calls continued to come in, but he insisted that there were many students at CUC that had wanted to become pastors and that they should be hiring him. Then he received a call from Gary DeBoer here in the BC conference to come to work. When Dad went to CUC, he had no plans on becoming a pastor. His plan was to go to CUC to take some courses that he thought would help him and give Bible studies, and him and Mom planned on moving back to the house, building their dream home, and then, like I said, give Bible studies. After a lot of praying and some negotiating, Dad and Mom packed up and moved to Vanderhoof District in 1986. The region had been planning a mini camp meeting at that time, and Dad helped to get the first camp meeting up in the northern area off the ground. And this was the plan that God had for Dad. Dad had a huge district, which included Vanderhoof to Burns Lake, Fort St. James, and all places in between. After 1 year, Dad and Mom headed to Kent, Washington to attend evangelism school for 4 months. This is the part that he had negotiated with Gary DeBoer. He wanted to do evangelism. They then headed back to Vanderhoof, and Dad had his first of many evangelistic series. Oh, that was when he was at Kent. From the Vanderhoof district, Dad accepted a call to Comox in the Powell River districts. While there, Dad and other evangelists held several series there. And there was many baptisms, and there was also a church plant in Campbell River. Dad also held stop smoking seminars. There was a lot of large industry in Campbell River, and they wanted their staff to get off of smoking, so he did a number of stop smoking clinics there. Well, in the Comox district, Dad started the Island Camp meeting, which is still running to this day, by bringing in speakers like Ron Halverson Sr., Ron Jr., Morris Vinden, etc. Now, with Ron, there was a bit of bribery that went on. Ron loved to fish, as you can see, and so Dad made arrangements for Ron to get out on the ocean and go fishing for salmon. Needless to say, they were both happy with the decision. From here, Dad and Mom moved to Victoria, where they spent 5 years, and again, evangelism being the focus of his ministry. As a result of the multiple evangelistic series that Dad had a passion for, many individuals were baptized in the 5 years that Dad was there. Dad also had the privilege of going to Ukraine and doing a couple series in Ukraine as well. Dad also had a passion for the youth in the church, and when in Victoria, he had weekly visits to Lakeview Academy to spend time with the kids there. Dad was also known for his weddings, and he even had one couple come all the way from Switzerland for him to perform their wedding. And one supper, Dad did between 12 and 15 weddings. And that meant that Mom and Dad also did premarital counseling for that many people. From Victoria, they moved to the Lower Mainland, where Dad organized 2 citywide evangelistic seminars with multiple interpreters for Mandarin, Spanish, Russian, Korean, and more. Following the first meeting, Dad started the Burnaby SDA Church.
So at this time, Dad received a call to move to Keene, Texas, to pastor with a focus on evangelism. But before accepting the call, Dad called me first to see if there was any chance of any little ones that might be on the way. It just happened to be so. So Dad turned down the call so that he and Mom would not miss out on spending time with their grandchildren. Carly arrived on October 31st, 1997. You could not have had a more proud papa. This is something Carly wrote. Carly says, "My papa was one of my favorite people in the entire world. He was my best friend. One of my favorite things I would do for Papa would be sneaking him fresh-baked treats. I would bake all afternoon with my grandma in the summers, and then when she would slip down to the basement to work on sewing, I'd grab whatever we just baked that was supposed to be cooling on the racks, and I would run it over to him. He would quickly shovel it into his mouth before my grandma came back up the stairs. It was the most important job I'll ever have." Another special thing that I got to do for my grandpa was give him pedicures. I don't like to touch anybody's feet, but it was different when it was my papa. On Saturday afternoon, right after lunch, my papa would lay back on his recliner and put his feet up for me. I would sit on the floor and work on his feet for hours while he napped. I even gave him the occasional makeover and curled what he had left on his head with Q-tips. Saturday afternoons were always my favorite time with him. There was nothing better after a good meal than pushing over my armchair next to him and holding his hand while he napped. My earliest fond memory of my papa included laying in our blue hammock together in the backyard and coming home from school in the spring and being surprised by the figure of my papa waiting on the front door for me at our house. He would always have a canned mango juice for me and a big bag of lychee nuts, and he would peel them and feed me. I loved him so dearly, and I will never forget my very first best friend. This was from Carly, who said she is Dad's favorite granddaughter. Now, Madison might have something to say about that.
Yeah. Dad then was asked to be the pastor of the Surrey Church, and once again, evangelism was an important part of the ministry, and of course, the youth. Each Friday evening, Dad would head over to the Soons for Bible studies. And because of Dad's passion for evangelism, there were many baptisms that took place while he was at the Surrey Church.
Now, Madison arrived a year and 5 hours after Carly on November 1st, 1998. Their mom was in labor to fireworks because it was on Halloween 2 years in a row. My grandfather, this is Madison talking, my grandfather was a terrific person. He always cared about helping others before himself, and he had the biggest heart of any man I know. He truly embodied what it meant to be a man of God, what it meant to be a proper and faithful pastor, and what it meant to love those around you. I will always remember our summers together, sitting in front of the RV, eating sunflower seeds, going swimming in the Okanagan, and enjoying every moment of the season. I received so much love from my grandfather. The small snacks he knew I liked that he would surprise me with, how he would sit down and help me with my homework when I was young, and how we would watch Full House together and laugh and laugh. I have nothing but love and adoration for my grandfather. He was a great man, and his memory will remain strong in the lives of everyone that had the honor of being able to know him.
Then in 2000, Dad received a call from Shawn Boonstra to join the It Is Written team as their evangelism coordinator. Dad's first series with Shawn was Saskatchewan, and then the 2002 Net series broadcasted from Dalhousie University and Halifax around the world. During this time, with It Is Written, he coordinated several series in other provinces, except for Quebec, PEI, and New Brunswick, where he organized training programs for church members in preparation of the Net series and other seminars. In 2004, Shawn became the speaker director of International, and Bill Santos joined the team of It Is Written Canada and speaker. Dad's first series with Bill was in Newfoundland. And the last series that Dad coordinated for It Is Written was just prior to his retirement, and this was when he was in Winnipeg, where he was asked to stay as an interim pastor, as one of the local churches did not have a pastor at that time. So Mom and Dad stayed there for about 6 months as Dad served as the pastor.
Now, you thought I was kidding about the 3 hours, didn't you? Huh? Yeah, we're almost done here. So unbeknownst to his family, Dad knew that he was having some health issues, but he didn't mention it to anyone. Mom and the family were shocked when he retired, as we thought that he would work forever. Soon after this, we started to notice Dad's hands shaking. Even with his health issues, Dad did one more evangelistic series in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, as this was an Aldergrove church mission trip. All of us went to Mexico and had a great time helping out with the different projects. During this time, Dad's shaking was very noticeable, as when he was doing his presentations, he would try to click the button to advance the slides, and he would shoot through 5 or 10 in a row slides at once. In December of 2009, Dad saw a neurologist and was diagnosed with Parkinson's, which later became Parkinson's dementia. Dad did not get angry about the diagnosis, but accepted that he was not immune to disease and suffering of humanity.
For the next 7 years, Dad and Mom spent the winter months in Desert Hot Springs, area where Dad was very involved in the church. Dad loved to go down south, where he would drive his grandkids around in the golf cart and spent hours in the pools. It was not uncommon for Dad to spend 4 to 5 hours in the pool at one time, chatting up all the park residents. During this time, Dad was developing more and more symptoms of Parkinson's, and Mom became more and more of a caretaker until Dad was no longer able to go south.
Now, when I was in high school and college, Dad's nickname was Big Donnie, and my nickname was Little Donnie. And Dad was a big man in stature. He stood 6'5" and 3/4 inches. He had a big heart, a big laugh, and big hugs. On January 31st, 2017, Dad ended up in the hospital, and in March of 2017, Dad had to be moved into the care home as his situation deteriorated. Dad was moved into Maplewood Housing in Abbotsford, where the staff were just amazing. When Dad was living at Maplewood, he had many guests that would brighten his visits. You know, when you get this Parkinson's dementia, it robs you of your mind, and your mind betrays you, and you hear things that aren't being said. You see things that aren't actually happening. And so you never know how people are going to turn out. But some of the interesting things, when Dad was in the home, in the 6 years that he was in there, I never heard him say one swear word or one curse word ever. And I was surprised by that. And you might say, well, he was a pastor, but when your mind does that, and I was really amazed. And one of the coolest things that happened, it happened 3 times only. But Donna and I, we were visiting him, and we'd like to sing hymns and have fun. And, he would talk all this nonsense, and we called it gobbledygook. And so one time, we were leaving, and we said, Dad, would you like to have a prayer for us? And somewhere in his mind, he kicked in to that old prayer part, and he prayed a totally intelligible prayer from beginning to end. And it made total sense. And then he said amen, and then he went back to speaking gobbledygook. It was amazing. It was incredible. Now, unlike his roommates, who had this incredible talent of stringing together 4-letter words and yelling them out at the top of their lungs, there was one lady, I can share one example, it's a G-rated version, where she would constantly, at the top of her lungs the entire time we're there, she would yell, "Help me! Help me!" And it was so annoying. And it would get so old after a while. And one time we were in there talking with Dad, and she was behind Dad in the other room. And she wouldn't stop. "Help me! Help me!" And Dad turned around and he said, "Shut up!" And then he turned back and smiled at us with this big old grin. As a family, and maybe this isn't the right way, but this was the right way for our family. We decided to cope and adapt to this disease with laughter and humor, just as he would have wanted us to. And we looked at the funny parts, and over the years, we would write down, we called them Papa-isms. And, I want to share some of these with you, but I also want to share something else. I know maybe you have experienced this, but there comes a time when every parent realizes that their child is stronger and more powerful than them. And there's this mutual respect that takes place. And if you can show this picture, this happened last year when Dad turned 80. I could take him finally at the age of 80. And so I want to share some of these Papa-isms with you. And like I said, we laughed at it as much as we could. So even though he was losing his mind, he still realized that he had to be bathed and clothed by other people, and it was kind of hard on his modesty. And he would tell us, I don't know where this comes from, he said, "I needed to tell those Jewish people why I'm half naked." I don't know what that meant. Another time he was sharing a story with us where he said, "I went for a walk and a helicopter landed and 4 men got out and kidnapped me. And I said to them, you will be sorry. And then I thought, I bet you Lawrence is behind this. Another time, I don't want to get too political here, but
He will.
another time he was sharing his beliefs about the NDP. And he said, all they do is eat and poop and squawk. That was my favorite, by the way. One Sabbath on May 18th, Dad said, is that a fire hydrant that's moving? It shouldn't be moving. Is it moving? Maybe I'm nuts. And then the female care aides would come around to help him. And he says, oh, here we go. The girls have come a-courtin'. And then one time when Carly got her driver's license, she came and she said, Papa, I need some driving advice. And he said, Carly, when you're airborne, you're airborne. Whatever that means. And he also said he was really upset one week and he was tired of one of his church members who keeps playing dead at church. And that probably could represent a lot of us. And one time I FaceTimed Mom, who was in Summerland, and her face came on and Dad said, oh no, I was just going to start gossiping about you. And then another time he called Madison over to him, and he said, sweetie, you can tell me whatever you want because I can only retain it for a minute. Another time we said, Dad, how you doing? And he said, I'm fine, but I'd like to get a bit finer. And then finally, one day Dad was in a really good mood and he was really loud, and Mom was trying to quiet him down. Honey, quiet, quiet. And as we were pushing him down the hall, he loudly proclaims, sometimes a rooster has to crow when a rooster has to crow. And that was Papa-isms, okay? So Dad lived in Maplewood House for the next 6 years until he passed peacefully on May 6, 2023, with his family surrounding him, sleeping now in peace until the Lord comes. Donna and I were able to spend 3 hours with him as Mom and Sandy rushed there, and they actually got there with 25 minutes to go before Dad passed. After Dad passed, we all had a good cry, and we comforted each other, and then there was this solemn silence. And almost as it was on cue, that lady was outside the door yelling, help me, help me. And it felt so inappropriate that all we could do was burst into laughter. So, Mom,
Okay, so the funny thing is when we were doing this, Lawrence said, you can't get up front because you're not going to make it through this, right?
I was betting her $50 that she couldn't do it.
Oh, you owe me 50, that's right.
Yes. So, Mom,
So our mom and dad were a huge legacy of what a marriage should be. Your go.
and, your love story leaves a legacy about unconditional love. And that's the unconditional love we have for our children and for our partner. Or the partner one day we hope Sandy gets. And Mom, you supported Dad, and he would have never accomplished half of what he did without you. And you deserve a medal, or 2 or 3. So, Big Donnie, we love you, we miss you, and we will see you in the morning.
So right now we're going to actually sing Dad's favorite song, which is I Have the Joy, Joy, Joy Down in My Heart. And he was very adamant that this was a song that we would sing at his funeral. So we hope you will all join us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Glenys, and I'm from Victoria. And I'll just add this, that it's because of Pastor Don I am in this church today. 30 years ago, when they were holding evangelistic meetings in Victoria, we were told about it and went. And so Pastor Don was my very first pastor in the Adventist church. So thank you to the family for letting me be part of this today. So if you've been sitting for a while, so I'm going to ask you to stand with me, and we're going to make a lot of noise here for this song. I've got the joy, joy, joy to sing his favorite song. I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Down in my heart today. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I have the love of Jesus in my heart. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I have the love of Jesus in my heart. I've got the peace that passeth understanding down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. I've got the peace that passes understanding down in my heart. Down in my heart today. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I have the love of Jesus in my heart. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I have the love of Jesus in my heart. I've got the love of Jesus down in my heart. Down in my heart. Down in my heart. I've got the love of Jesus down in my heart. Down in my heart Tuesday. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I have the love of Jesus in my heart. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I have the love of Jesus in my heart. Amen.
Good afternoon. My name is Eugene Skoretz, and I'd like to thank the Stoyanowski family for allowing me to say a few words here. Hard act to follow after Sandy and Lawrence. Anyways, a number of years ago, we were together with Phyllis and Don, and they were doing introductions. And Phyllis says, Eugene used to work for Don. Kind of took me by surprise, but she's absolutely right. I met Don 39 years ago at Camp Hope. And I'd worked security there a few years prior. And this one particular year, Don was the head security chief, boss, I called him. We really hit it off. I don't know why. Maybe it's because we're both Ukrainian, Nasha Luda, we stick together, but I admired the gentleman for years. A couple examples of Don's leadership. It was one hot sunny afternoon, and I got a call on the walkie-talkie that go down to this site number because there was someone smoking outside their truck and camper. So I started to walk down there, and I thought, yeah, it's probably some teenager or youth. That's easy to handle. But it was a gentleman sitting beside his truck and camper, just enjoying a cigarette. I said, now how am I going to handle this? Nothing came to mind. I said, how would Don handle this? Nothing came to mind. So I picked up the walkie-talkie. He says, Don, I need some help. He says, where are you? I told him. We met him there, and I explained the situation. He says, let's walk down together. As we're walking down, the gentleman had lit up another cigarette, and we're just sitting there. Don, with his big smile, started a conversation with the gentleman, and I just stood there. And a lady came out of the camper and just stood there, and Don said hello, and just smiling and just carrying on a conversation. And he says, do you know, with this hot weather and the grass so dry, he says, we're trying to keep safety here because of potential fire hazard. And he says, if you'd like to have a cigarette, he says, you know, you're just 20 feet behind the truck and camper. There's a road there. Why don't you just walk down that road? He says, and then we wouldn't be so concerned about fire here. The guy got up off his chair and he walked straight to Don and he looked him straight in the face. Don told me later he thought the guy was going to punch him out. And like you said, Don was a big man. And he says, you're telling me I can smoke here if I take a walk behind the camper on this road? Don said, absolutely. The guy grabbed Don's hand and shook it. He said, you know what? I understand what you're trying to say. It is a potential fire hazard here. As we're about to leave, this gentleman's wife came up, coming to Don with her arms wide open and tears running down her face. I've been praying for years for my husband to join me at camp meeting. And he agreed to come this year. But he said if anyone told him, you can't smoke here, he says, I'm gone. She said, I want to thank you so much, Pastor. Talk about wisdom, love, and compassion. Don had it. Don also had a mischievous side to him. During security, if we found someone with firecrackers, we would ask them if they would turn it over to us. They usually would, some of them. So one evening, it was quiet, and Don and I were just driving around. And Don says, let's go up to the youth hill. So we go to the youth hill. Don pulls out a couple firecrackers from his pocket. And we lit them. He said, let's go down to the junior building in there. So we go down the junior building. Don looks around, nobody there. A couple more firecrackers go off. He said, let's go down by the pastor's cabins. There's nothing usually happening over there. So we lit a couple more firecrackers. Just then a pastor comes out of a cabin there and says, what's going on here? He says, I hear fireworks going off. And Don says, we're on top of it. No problem. You know, we never got caught. But then Don gets on his walkie-talkie and he just to all the security, and he says, where are the security? He says, I hear fireworks going off. Aren't you guys working tonight? That was Don. And then always on the last Saturday night of camp meeting, Don would treat all security and spouses to pizza. I'm sorry, Brad, but in my opinion, they don't make preachers like that anymore. Years later, as Don's health began to decline, Phyllis and Don asked if they could use our swimming pool for baptism. Of course. And what a beautiful Sabbath day it turned out to be, with nice weather, good friends, and a huge blessing for all who attended. Pastors Dauncey and Don in their burgundy gowns stepped into the water. I like that song, by the way. Pastor Dauncey was there to assist Don to baptize Carly and Maddie, his precious granddaughters. Don didn't need any help. He did a fantastic job. Don and Phyllis wintered in Desert Hot Springs, as you had related to. We met regularly Tuesday evenings at the Beckner home for Bible study. And all who attended were richly blessed by Don and Phyllis's input in our discussions. And Phyllis and Don organized guest speakers for Friday night Vespers. That church was packed. More people on Friday night Vespers than during Sabbath. As years passed, as Don had to go to a care home, when we used to visit Don, he had such a big winning smile, and Gwen loved his twinkling blue eyes. It seemed to all of us who knew him, staff, the residents, and the visitors, enjoyed his company. One example he set for us. He always mentioned Phyllis, Sandy, and Lawrence, and he would tell us little stories about them. I know. He said, you know, you've got to talk to Phyllis because she wants to buy a gravel truck. And I guess one of Lawrence's friends was in the trucking business, and he could give Phyllis good advice, and we just chuckled. It's little stories that he told us, and they weren't stories, they were actually reality that he thought was really happening. What an example he set for us by love for his family. I had no other love have I seen with other families that he had for his family. And what a wise and godly man, right to the end. That was my Pastor Don. Our lives were truly blessed, having Don as a dear friend. And we cling to the blessed hope that we will see Don again. And what a beautiful day that'll be. Thank you, and God bless.
Well, hey guys, Pastor Bill Santos, Lessons for Living Television. Let me start by just sharing with you our deepest condolences. Phyllis, please know that Fatima and I, Joshua, Rebecca, we're saddened with the news of Pastor Don's passing, and please know that you and your family are in our prayers. I first met Pastor Don and Phyllis when I joined It Is Written. The end of 2003, beginning of 2004. It Is Written was going, Pastor Don and Phyllis were already working there. They had been brought in to help in the preparation and in the execution of the Halifax net series that Pastor Shawn and Pastor Henry Firerobin did. And then when Pastor Shawn was called to the U.S., and I was called to come to head up It Is Written Canada, Pastor Don and Phyllis decided to stay on, I think, and that was great that they did because, you know, we at that time also, Tracy moved back to Brazil because her dad was sick and Shawn was gone, and a brand new speaker, and it was nice to have them there and bring some stability to the ministry. And right away we got to work, and we prepared a evangelistic series in Newfoundland. I think that was the first one. Pastor Don and I shared the preaching responsibilities, and we had rented a house literally across the street from the venue. We were up on Signal Hill. I believe it was called the Geo Center, and it was a functioning, museum by day, and at night we would hold our meetings there, which meant that every night we had to tear down, and then every evening we had to set back up, and that was quite a task, putting out all the chairs and the screens and the projectors, and we had a lot of work. Pastor Don and I shared the preaching, as I said, and we had rented a house across the street, so we were literally staying across the street, and every night we'd make our way over to the Geo Center, and we'd set up, and we had to bring over cables and equipment and projectors, and we had very limited space in the Geo Centers where we could store things. So, most of the electronics, the computers, the projectors, the cables, all had to be taken back to the house every night and brought back to the Geo Center every evening. And so inevitably, in almost every night when we got started, we'd be setting up and Pastor Don would say, oh, I forgot, this cable. And he'd have to run back across and go and get it and bring it back. And every night, for the first few nights that happened. And one night he came to me and he said, listen, every night I seem to be forgetting something. I'm going to tell you, tomorrow I'm not going to forget anything. And I said, okay, how are you going to do that? He said, I'm going to prepare a list of everything I need to bring. I've got a list here, and I'm going to check that list, and check it twice and make sure everything is on the list before we head on over here. I said, that's great. That's terrific. And so the next evening, we're getting ready, and I'm in the car, and we're getting ready to head over, and Pastor Don climbs in, and I said, okay, are you ready to go? And he goes, yep, just 1 second. I go, what? He says, I need to go back inside. I said, why? He says, I forgot the list. And so that's just how it went. Another time, we had brought somebody with us, and for the life of me, I can't remember her name, and that's horrible. A Filipino lady that wanted to join us when we went overseas. Well, we figured, we're going to Newfoundland. You are going to go over some water, and we asked if she'd like to come and join us, and she did, and she would cook for us, and we affectionately named her Cookie. And every so often she'd come to us and she'd say, hey, we need some supplies. And one day she said, hey, we need bread and we need water, for the water cooler, those big round, cylinders of water. And Pastor Don said, well, I'm going to be out running some errands. And so let me, I'll make a point of getting the water and getting the bread. And so he did. And so he bought the water, he bought the bread, and went about St. John's, Newfoundland, doing the errands and visitation and things that he had to do there. And with the bread and the big cylinder of water in the trunk of the car. Well, when he arrived back at the house we were renting, and he went to open the trunk, the water bottles had acted like a rolling pin back and forth in the trunk and had just flattened out all the loaves of bread so that they were about, the thickness of a pizza. And he pulls out the bags, and they're as flat as they can be because that water bottle has been rolling back and forth in the trunk of the car and has just flattened everything out. And so I could go on for hours with stories of Pastor Don's commitment to the It Is Written ministry, commitment to soul winning, because Pastor Don was all about winning souls. He had a passion to see people giving their life to Jesus. And just one other quick story. We buy our media through a broker, and while I was at It Is Written, we used a broker, Barrichello Media. I use them again now. And the principal at Barrichello Media was Maria Barrichello. And Maria had been brought into the It Is Written family. She's a non-Adventist lady, a wonderful Catholic lady, at the time of the Halifax Net series. She had been able to secure advertising and ad space and billboard space at a hugely discounted rate and save the church just literally tens of thousands of dollars. And so when I came on to It Is Written, Maria was already being involved, and we've continued to use her. And over the course of 25, 30 years, she has literally saved us millions of dollars. But Maria was diagnosed with cancer. And Pastor Don and Phyllis found out, and they visited her in a hospital in BC, in Vancouver. And Pastor Don had prayer with her, and Maria was healed. And till this day, she talks about the prayer of that righteous Pastor Don Stoyanowski, who prayed for her and healed, and she was healed by God's grace of the cancer. And so that's the kind of person Pastor Don was. That's what I remember about Pastor Don, his passion for souls, his tireless work ethic. And it's sad when we lay a warrior to rest, but we know that Pastor Don lived and died in the belief in the soon coming of Jesus. And I think the best thing we can do to honor him would be to continue working just as hard as we can in our little corner of the vineyard so that Jesus will in fact come soon. And so it is a sad moment when we say goodbye to someone as dear as Pastor Don, but we say it with our eyes focused on the soon coming of Jesus. And so Phyllis, you are in our prayers, your family's in our prayers. God bless you guys. And even so, come Lord Jesus.
My heart can sing when I pause to remember a heartache here is but a stepping stone along the trail that's winding always upward. This troubled world is not our final home. But until then, my heart will go on singing. Until then, with joy we'll carry on. Until that day, our eyes behold that city. Until the day God calls us home. We've listened to a lot of memories today. You guys have done a remarkable job and a tribute to your dad. I don't think I've ever heard better. And on behalf of the BC Conference, I want to say thank you, Phyllis, family. 15 years officially working here in the BC Conference, but a lifetime spent here. And I want to also say thank you on behalf of the churches in the South Okanagan. The Stoyanowskis and the Thorpes go back a little bit longer than the 15 years. Back in the 1960s, as you heard, you moved to Summerland, back to the Okanagan, and then Penticton. And so in my years growing up, when I think of church activities of the South Okanagan, you guys were always a part of that. And Don and Phyllis and all the family that gathered together, it was a very, very blessed time. So I want to thank you for that contribution, Phyllis, and the wonderful contribution that both of you and the entire family made. It was a wonderful, wonderful blessing. When I think of Don, I think of a big man, 6'6". He might have gone down a quarter of an inch or something you described, but he was a big guy. And he had a big laugh, a big heart. He had huge capacity for work. He was amazing. But his smile was the thing I'll always remember. Always that big, wonderful, accepting smile. Fantastic. What a blessing. So, as we've heard the stories of the life and the wonderful ministry, I just want to thank you for all of these things. And thank God for using those things to touch so many people's lives. Without question, you and Don, Phyllis, impacted my life extremely positively. You encouraged me to consider ministry. I'm thankful for that. And I know that what you have done will echo, re-echo, ripples of influence will continue on. And I just look forward to that day when we're all going to be together in heaven. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I apologize for not being there in person today. I'm actually out on the road doing what Dawn taught me to do, which I guess in some ways seems kind of fitting. So I'm really glad that technology has made it possible to be together like this. You know, the job I've got right now is pretty much impossible because there's no way you can sum up the life of a really great man in just a few minutes. I mean, given the size of his impact on all of us, how do you boil down that life to just minutes? I'm going to try, though, because Don meant the world to both Gene and me. So let's pray. Father in heaven, life in a broken world can offer us some really tough moments. But we know you understand because you've been here and you've promised to hold our hearts really close right now. I pray that I'll be found faithful, both to Don's memory and to you. For I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. My first memory of Don is the night he stood up at the front of the auditorium down at the Crystal Garden in Victoria to tell the audience that somebody had vandalized his church overnight. Now, the way I remember it, I think they broke some windows, and I got the impression at least that it was some kind of retaliation against the church for daring to have public meetings. Of course, these were the meetings where Gene and I had been coming every single night. And the moment Don got up front and introduced himself, we both instinctively liked him because who didn't like Don? The concept of stranger was completely foreign to him, and he had this incredible way of winning over a room in about 10 seconds. And little did we know that night what meeting him was going to mean for both of us. 2 weeks later, he cleared us for baptism in the mother's room at the back of the church with Ruben Matiko, and now he was Pastor Don. And a few months after that, both Don and Phyllis just kind of became our family. And you know, I think it's more than a little appropriate that when I first got the news that Don was gone, I had just stepped off the platform at the Winsport Arena in Calgary, where I was preaching about the second coming of Christ and the resurrection. I remember it well. I said good night to the audience. I walked off the platform, and as soon as I got in my car, my phone rang, and it was Gene telling me that Don was gone. And I don't know that there could have been a better setting to find that out. 30 years ago, he started me doing this work, and I was still doing it the moment we lost him. Now, of course, in some ways, you guys had been missing Don for quite a while already because of the way this cruel disease affected him. And I remember when I called you, Phyllis, that you said you really lost him twice. And I've been thinking about that a lot over the last few weeks because it's true. You lost him twice. And what happened to Don is completely unfair. I mean, I understand that's the way the world is, but it never seemed right to me that after a lifetime of serving God so selflessly, he ended up in a care facility, far too young. But I do know this, because Don shared this with me quite a few years ago. There's this promise in the Bible, in the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 25, where God tells his people, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten." Now, I'm ripping that out of context just a little bit because this was actually referring to the way that God's people had brought misery on themselves, and that wasn't true for Don. He didn't do this to himself. But I still think that we can claim that promise anyway because the suffering we endure isn't any one person's fault, but it is because we made such a shipwreck of this creation as the human race. So in the book of Joel, God is saying, listen, hang in there. I'm going to give it all back, every last bit of it. And that means everything gets restored. The last 6 years, when the cruelty of this disease stole him from you, you get that back. Those times when you went to visit him and he couldn't remember who you were, you get that back too. You get complete restoration. We all get a do-over. In the book of Joel, the locusts don't win. And God says in this case, they don't win here either. So here's what I'd like to do today, because Don's contribution to the kingdom was bigger than just about anybody else I know of in this church. I mean, I've been at work for the church for 3 decades now, and I've never met somebody as effective as Don. In fact, I've often wished that I could take every pastor in the NAD and enroll them in the Don Stoyanowski School of Soul Winning, because in 30 years, I've never seen anything like him. I mean, let me tell you what I learned, because I'm a graduate of that school, and right now I'm about to violate one of Don's wishes because he wanted this to be short today. So he's going to have to forgive me when we meet up at the resurrection. I mean, his instructions were really clear. Shawn, he said, the sermon has to be short, it has to be about Jesus, not about me, and it has to have an appeal at the end. I want it to be evangelistic. So I'm going to do my very best to honor his wishes, but I'm telling you, the short part, that's not going to be easy. My key passage comes from Isaiah chapter 55. It's in verse 10 and verse 11. It's a passage that's been playing in my mind a lot over the last few weeks. Here's what the prophet says. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. Okay, so with that text in mind, I'm going to tell you some of the most important things I learned in the Don Stoyanowski School of Evangelism. Lesson number 1. I'm not sure if I should bring this up today because Don can't really defend himself, but it was Don Stoyanowski who taught me how to beat a speeding ticket. I remember we were headed for some meetings out in Machosen, and it was dark out, and I was riding in the passenger seat of the van, and wouldn't you know it, we suddenly got pulled over. Not that that was unusual for Don, but this time it was because he supposedly had a broken taillight, or at least that was the excuse the cop used for pulling him over. I'm pretty sure he was also speeding because when wasn't Don speeding? So the officer came to the window with a flashlight and asked Don for his license and registration. So he pulled out his wallet and fished around really slowly for way too long, and he kept tilting his wallet into the light of the flashlight as if he needed the light to find his license. And I could see it. I could see his license sitting there as plain as day the whole time, so I wondered what he was doing. And then suddenly, the cop let him go. Have a good evening, sir. Make sure you get that taillight fixed. And it was over. The cop was gone and we were on our way. Now, I was speechless because cops always nailed me to the wall. And when the officer was back in his car, Don leaned over and told me, listen, Shawn, always keep your ministerial credential right beside your license and make sure the officer sees it. And you know something? I've been living in the United States for 2 decades now, and I've been pulled over a lot, probably at least once a year. And thanks to my training at the Don Stoyanowski School of Evangelism, I have never gotten a ticket. And so far, I'm guessing Don has saved me somewhere in the neighborhood of about $3,000 in speeding fines. Lesson number 2. Don actually taught me how to keep the romance alive in a relationship. I think Don's dating stories are still my all-time favorites, including the time he took you, Phyllis, to the carnival and you guys went on the tilt-a-whirl, which proved to be a little much for Don, because in all the excitement of a date with a beautiful girl and all that twirling around and whirling, he suddenly threw up in the seat. And that's when centrifugal force took effect and all that, well, I don't want to get too graphic, but all that sick suddenly slid for the outside of the seat right into you, Phyllis, and you were wearing white pants. And this had to be the moment that Don realized you were the woman for him, because who in the world goes on another date after something like that? Then there was the time he decided to write you a really romantic love letter, Phyllis, and he took a sheet of paper and expressed his incomparable love and devotion to you by writing the words, "Hiya, Porky," across the top of the page. And for some unknown reason, Phyllis, you didn't dump him then either. And then there was the time he pulled into your driveway and you were bent over the flower bed weeding, and so he hollered at you, "Wowee, look what I see." At which point you stood up and turned around, except it wasn't you. It was your mother. So here I am, a graduate of the Don Stoyanowski School of Evangelism and the Don Stoyanowski School of Romance. I mean, he even performed our wedding, and that marriage is still going strong after 30 years. Lesson number 3. Don knew how to appreciate fine vegetarian cuisine, and he introduced us to the Bokong restaurant in Vancouver. I think there was another one in Surrey. And I'll admit, when we got there, the food was every bit as amazing as Don said it would be. And at one point, somebody at the table complained, "Man, if only our church members could make vegetarian food that tasted this good." So Don asked the waiter what their secret was. Where in the world do you guys get the ingredients for your fake meat? And because they knew Don well and they loved him, I mean, who didn't love Don? They took him to the back of the restaurant and showed him their supply room. A room that was stacked to the rafters with big cans of Worthington products. It seems that Bokong was just a 4-star Adventist potluck. And really, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what he taught me about fine dining, because Well, there was this other time when we were in an undisclosed city. I'm going to protect the people involved, and I'll just tell you, this city was somewhere in Canada. And one of our dear sisters at the church made us some food to take home one evening after the meetings. So as you can imagine, we were pretty excited because, well, most of the time in a campaign, you don't get to eat during the day. And we were really, really thankful for the bounty this lady had provided. That is, until we sat at the table and Don put a forkful of that food in his mouth and his face suddenly changed. "What's the matter?" I said. "This is awful," he said. "It's completely inedible." So I took a bite and he was right. It tasted like soap. In fact, I think I would have preferred eating soap. So because there was no way we were going to eat this stuff, Don picked it all up and scraped the whole works right into the trash can. And I panicked a little bit because we were going to see that lady the next day. "Don, we're going to see her tomorrow and she's going to ask how we liked it. What am I going to say?" And I'll never forget his answer. "Shawn, just tell her we put it on the table and the next thing you know, it was all gone." And when you know it, that's what I told her, and it worked. That's what I told her when I brought back the empty dish, and she was thrilled. So that day, Don taught me, well, it's possible to be completely honest and not hurt somebody's feelings at the same time. Lesson number 4, and I know I'm going too long now and breaking my promise to keep this short, but this is really important. When Gene and I were baptized, Don put us both on one arm. We were baptized together. And in the 30 years since he did that, I've learned the hard way. You should probably be as tall as Don before you try that. I haven't actually drowned any baptismal candidates yet, but it's gotten close. So personally, I've abandoned that practice. But here's what he taught me that day. That tiny attention to detail, that little gesture to make our day seem special, it taught me early on that you love people into the kingdom of God. You don't argue people into the kingdom, you love them in. Don won people to Christ because he treated everybody like they were the most important person in the world. He was going out of his way to make our big day, our baptism, seem memorable. And that double baptism completely cemented the fact that Gene and I would be serving God together for the rest of our lives. You know, just a few months after we were baptized, Don performed our wedding. Prior to joining the church, we had already booked a gorgeous cathedral downtown. And I mean, that cathedral was beautiful. But then we moved our wedding, if you don't mind some honesty, to the absolutely hideous Seventh-day Adventist church, this nondescript white box on Pandora Street. It looked like a warehouse, and it was so unattractive that a lot of people just called it Pandora's box. St. Andrew's Cathedral? It had hardwood floors and elaborate stained glass windows. The Adventist church had avocado green shag carpet, and it seemed like 2 windows in the sanctuary, well, none of them matched each other. Some were white, some were yellow. But you know something? We didn't care, because this was our church. And this was the pastor we loved and the pastor who loved us, and that was more important than anything else that day. So we invited all of our non-Adventist friends and family, and some of them thought they've lost their minds becoming Seventh-day Adventists. But they loved that wedding. And they loved it because it was so obvious to everybody that Don was different from all the other clergy they had ever met. He wasn't just going through the motions, performing a rite or a ritual. It was obvious that he cared about the people getting married. He actually knew them, and he worked little personal details into the service every single time. In fact, to this day, I still model the weddings I do after the one that Don did for us. I mean, he did such a good job that absolutely all the young couples in that church that day wanted Don to do their weddings. And he almost had to open a drive-through wedding chapel to accommodate all the requests. And I remember at one of those weddings for a Greek Orthodox family, actually Gene's former employer, the family asked Don to give the invocation before dinner, and they introduced him to the crowd as Father Don. And he just laughed with that big, deep belly laugh that he had, and he told the room, "I guess there's been a conversion." And with that, he prayed. And they loved him. Because again, who didn't love Don? Don Stoyanowski was the brightest example I've ever seen of God's love put in motion. When you met him, you always got a peek into the character of God, from the way he helped people to the way he ended every meeting with every individual with, "Hey, let's have a little prayer." He spent his ministry helping people. I joined him as he relocated a single mother to a new secret location so that her abusive husband couldn't find her. I joined him as he went to court to support people, just to sit there in the courtroom with them, even if he knew they were guilty. I sat in hundreds and hundreds of homes and watched him show the love of God by helping people sort out their personal problems, not by offering a lot of advice, but by just listening to them and loving them. And of course, as most of you know, he also baptized most of those people. You know, he even went out of his way to get me home for the birth of our first child. Actually, it was the both of you, Phyllis. We were holding evangelistic meetings in Surrey, and one night when I was really tired, I decided to unplug the phone. I just ripped the cord out of the wall so I could avoid being disturbed and finally get a good night's sleep. And about 6 o'clock in the morning, I rolled over and plugged the phone back in, and it rang the second I plugged it in immediately, and it was Don. Shawn, he said, "You might want to call home because your wife's been in labor since last night." Now, in my defense, Jean wasn't actually due for another 2 weeks, and I was supposed to be home on time, but what do I know about babies? So the two of you, Phyllis, got me straight to the airport. I didn't even stop to shave that morning, even though there was another meeting I was supposed to preach at the church that evening. And Don went back to the church and preached my meeting, and then the two of you packed up my apartment and mailed me all my stuff. And that's what I learned in the Don Stoyanowski School of Evangelism. If you want people to meet Christ, go out of your way to love them. And I guarantee that right now, a lot of you are thinking about all the times that Don invested in your lives. Because it's what he did. It's who he was. And he did it even when he was tired, after he spent another sleepless night in that big lazy boy because his knees hurt so bad. Lesson number 5. Don taught me to invest in people. He was always building people up, helping them succeed, and that seemed more important to him than his own success. Of course, I don't know what he was thinking when he let me preach in his pulpit just a few months after my baptism, but that's exactly what he did. I've always been terrified of public speaking. It's still true to this day, and there was about zero chance of any success in the pulpit that day, but Don let me do it. He let me preach. He encouraged me to try. So I went back home and wrote my first sermon ever. I kid you not, I hand wrote 40 pages of notes, 40 pages with a ballpoint pen. Don gave me the 8 a.m. service, which was really good thinking because, well, 1, the crowd is much smaller at 8 o'clock, and 2, if I really blew it, he could cancel me and preach himself at 11. So with my heart thumping wildly in my chest, I walked up to the pulpit that morning and plopped my stack of notes on top of it. And that pile of paper was so thick you could hear it landing on the pulpit 5 rows back. And there was this guy near the front, I'm pretty sure it was Ed Moberly, who leaned over to his wife and said, "Oh no, I think he's going to read the whole thing." And I did. I read every last bit of that sermon, and no word of a lie, I was so nervous I was finished 40 pages in 8.5 minutes. The church obviously was delighted because their affliction proved to be light and fleeting, and they all got to leave 15 minutes early. It was hands down, the worst sermon ever preached in the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But I'll never forget Don. He was glowing. He told me it was great, even though everybody in the room knew that sermon stunk. But what mattered to him was the fact that I tried, and he made it his business to keep investing in me, to keep giving me opportunities. So I did it again and again and again. And I remember on one occasion when the early service was finished, he was waiting for me in the back because I'd said something up front that wasn't theologically true. And so between church services, he actually took the time to help me rewrite that sermon so that at 11 o'clock, it was true. Lesson number 6, and then I'll be done, maybe. Don had an incredibly rare level of dedication and persistence, unlike anything I've ever seen. And he understood that in the kingdom of God, talent is useful, and he had an awful lot of talent, but in the kingdom of God, persistence and prayer are far more important. Pile up all the degrees you want, polish your gifts of rhetoric and eloquence, but Don understood that nothing is as powerful as a humble Christian who refuses to quit in the cause of Christ. When Don decided something was going to happen, it happened. We had the chance to work together for a second time at It Is Written Canada over in Oshawa, and we hired this contractor to help us build some new office spaces, and turns out the guy was a crook. So Don fired him, of course, yet we still had to get that job finished that summer. So we ran the ministry during the day, and we built offices at night until they were all done. And that was the hallmark of his entire career. He never quit. In fact, Phyllis, you told me that right near the end, just days before you lost him, the nurse walked into his room and found him preaching to an invisible audience, even though he'd lost the ability to communicate quite a while ago. He literally died doing what he loved, serving God. And this time he was preaching to his final audience, an audience of angels that cannot wait to come and wake him up. You know, Don told me that when he first got to Victoria, he tried to persuade the church that they should do public evangelism. And of course, a number of people argued with him because, well, that always happens. So finally, he talked them into holding a Revelation seminar down in the church basement with a budget of only about $200. And of course, once the congregation saw Don in action, their perception began to shift. They realized they'd been objecting to a caricature of evangelism, which is what most people do. Don actually baptized some folks in those meetings, which surprised the church. So then he proposed public meetings in a public venue. And now the church was far more inclined to cooperate. He was persistent, and they listened. They rented the Crystal Garden, this swanky indoor tropical garden with a beautiful auditorium, and that's the room where Gene and I first met him. 6 weeks later, after those meetings, Gene and I were Seventh-day Adventists because Don persisted. He never quit. He always persisted. And now, that's enough from me. Because the person Don really wanted you to hear from today was Jesus, and so I'm going to let him do some of the talking. Don specifically asked that you hear from the last words found in the book of Revelation. So maybe I'll start with a verse that became my favorite specifically because Don showed this to me when I was a brand new believer. The Bible says, "Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people. God Himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away.' Then He who sat on the throne said, 'Behold, I make all things new.' And He said to me, 'Write, for these words are true and faithful.'" In other words, God is saying, this is a promise you can take to the bank. You can write it down. The tears we're shedding right now, that's going to pass. God will wipe them away. I mean, tears are important because it's how we actually heal from this huge hole that losing Don has left in everybody's lives. And of course, that brings me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which is a favorite for most of us, where the Bible says this, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope." You know, from time to time, I've heard some Christian preachers say we shouldn't cry at a memorial service, at a funeral, because, well, crying's not biblical. Don't you have hope? But think about this. Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, and if anybody understands the pain of loss, it's Jesus. Paul is telling us not that we shouldn't sorrow, but that we shouldn't sorrow like people that don't have hope. And in this case today, we have a lot of hope. The hope that Don taught most of us to have. He continues, "For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with Him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord Himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord." You know, over the last 30 years, since Don got me started doing this work, I've traveled the world. I've met people on every continent except for one, and still I have never, and I mean this sincerely, I have never met someone as faithful as dedicated as Pastor Don. Nobody has moved the needle for the cause of Christ like he did. And I can promise you this, resurrection morning is going to be incredibly busy just because he was so faithful. Oh, and you know, those early naysayers who said public evangelism doesn't work, I've been keeping track since Don got the ball rolling all those decades ago. And right now I can tell you I've personally seen more than 100,000 people come to Christ because Don started all of that. And he's going to hear those words from Jesus, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." You know, this memorial service wouldn't be what Don wanted if I didn't make an invitation. So right now I'd like you all to think about the way that a relationship with Christ made this incredible man so important to so many of us. I mean, think about all the lives that have been changed because Don loved Jesus, and it includes most of you in this room. So here's what I'd like to ask you. We know we're going to see Don again because God will be faithful and bring him back, restore him to us. And I wouldn't miss that moment for the world. So the question is, would you? Let me invite you to be there. Get to know the God that Don loves so much, the God who made him such a powerful influence for good in a very painful, very broken world. Our lives are all better because he surrendered to Christ. Consider the claims of Jesus. Listen to his invitation. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me." Look, I'm pretty sure there's not going to be a Bokong restaurant in heaven. And I'm pretty sure that whatever we do have there, it's not going to be made out of Worthington products. But I do know this. It'll be amazing. Not for the food, for the company. Because the Jesus that Don loves so much, the one that he served, he's going to be there. And so will Don. And so will I. And you'll be there too. If you want. If you want. And you know, if I have a little trouble finding Don in that massive crowd on my first day in the kingdom, I mean, it's going to be hard to find people, but I know how to do it. I'll just be quiet for a moment, and I'll listen. And you'll listen too, and you'll hear it. Little froggy jumped so high, he touched the sky. Bingo, bongo, baby. And you'll have found him. So good night, Don. I look forward to seeing you in the morning. Thanks for what you've done for all of us.
Shall we gather at the river where bright angel feet have trod, with its crystal tide forever flowing by the throne of God? Yes, we'll gather at the the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. On the margin of the river, washing up its silver spray, we will walk and worship ever all the happy golden day. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. Soon we'll reach the shining river. Soon our pilgrimage will cease. Soon our happy hearts will quiver with the melody of peace. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God.
I just have to tell you this afternoon that this has been a very happy experience for me, even though it's terribly sad. Because Don and I were such good friends, and I enjoyed being around him, especially when he joined the pastoral staff here in British Columbia, and especially when he moved to the little town of Burns Lake in northern British Columbia. I could tell all kinds of experiences, but thank you, Lawrence and Sandy, for the history that you gave to us this afternoon. I might just tell you one little story that includes probably Phyllis more than anyone else. I was asked by Don to come to Cranbrook to hold an evangelistic series. That was a town, wasn't it, Cranbrook? And I said, well, I'm terribly busy in the conference here office. And he said, you come, and we'll have a good time together. And I said, okay, the only way I can do it is I got to fly down, and we can do it on the weekend. And he said, you come down, I'll get you. And so I came down, and we started on a Friday evening. What I wasn't expecting was what Phyllis did for us at the dining room table before the crusade began. I was all ready to go with my preaching, and we had the most delicious Ukrainian supper I've had in a long, long time. We had holopsy, we had pierogies, and we had all those good things, and I didn't realize I was so hungry, and I ate. It was so good, and I ate, and then Don said, now let's go. So we went down to the church for the meetings, and everything was all ready to go, and I got up to preach, and I couldn't think. I'll never forget it. The first thing, I knew what I was going to start in Daniel 2, but I couldn't think. Oh, those pierogies were so good. We had such a good time together. We were holding three nights a week. I'll just tell you one more experience. And so we wanted to do something else, and so he said, let's go to Sparwood. I didn't know where Sparwood was, a little coal mining town up there in the north. And I said, okay, if that's where you want to go, we'll go. And he said, I contacted the Anglican elder, and he arranged for us to have a room in the school to hold meetings in. And I said, okay, if you got it ready, let's go. So we went to the meetings there in that little schoolroom. By the way, I would really go anywhere Don decided he wanted to go, you know. And after the meeting, the elder came up to Don, and he said, we want you to preach this Sunday in our church. And Don said, well, our pastor would be glad to preach in your church. And so he said, are you willing to preach in our church on Sunday? And I said, I'm willing to do that. And so Sunday morning we showed up. Don took me over there to the church, one of these real old-fashioned churches with the benches in the front that were about 7 feet tall. And I sat in there, and while I was sitting waiting to preach, I heard some old ladies in the back room preparing for the choir. And so I thought I better go back and see what's going on here. And I went back there, and there was about 12 ladies, must have been 70, 80 years old, preparing to give the choir music. And so I said, oh, this is wonderful. I'm so glad that you're going to be singing today. This is great. And then Don was in there and said, oh, we can hardly wait, you know, till you sing. Well, it was as rickety as you can tell to do it, but it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And after the service, they said, oh, we've never had such encouragement from our choir as from you people. And I thought, well, at least we did some good there on Sunday. And after I got back with Don, he said, you know what? And I said, what? He said, the Anglican pastor got back this week, and boy, did he burn my ears. What in the world are Seventh-day Adventist preacher preaching in my Anglican church? Well, we've heard so many good things today. So many things that have blessed each one of us. I just love the text that Shawn used about those who died in Christ will rise first. Whenever I go to a large cemetery, or really any cemetery, I just think, what will that be like? Oh, I hope I can be by one on that morning. Then those who love him and are still alive, we're going to meet together and caught up in the sky to meet together. What a place to be on the resurrection morning. Don was a building contractor, I was a building contractor, and that really kind of cemented us together because we talked the same language. And that same language was theology and evangelism. It's the only thing that mattered. I'd like to invite you to stand together as we have our closing prayer. Our loving Heavenly Father, it has been so thrilling this afternoon to hear these stories about our good friend, our beloved friend, Don Stoyanowski, for Phyllis, for Sandy, for Lawrence, Donna, Carly, and Madison. Heavenly Father, we want to be caught up in the sky. We want to be caught up in the air together to meet. What a tremendous experience that is going to be. Help us each day as we journey this road that you've given us to walk on. Help us to remember this, and that we determine and that we make a commitment that there's nothing, I don't care how good it looks or how important it might seem, that would keep us from meeting those dear ones up there in the clouds with you. Thank you so much for Don. What he has meant to each one of us and the thousands of people's lives that he has touched. And as we leave this place this afternoon, help us never to forget what we've heard here today, because it's a story of what Jesus can do to anyone he touches and is willing to cooperate and to do something. So go with us now as we leave this place. Give us courage and strength and hope. Thank you so much for this privilege we've had today. Thank you so much. We love you. We long to see you. And we ask these blessings now in Jesus' precious and holy name. Amen.
If you could all be seated and wait for the family to exit, and then please come back and visit with us and enjoy some refreshments. And thank you all for coming and celebrating Big Donnie today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.